So to begin with, when we're talking about stuff needed to get started with Airsoft, let's talk about the elephant in the room and talk about guns. Not to be confused with the bear in the room, I don't feel like dressing up for this video, so I enlisted my wife's teddy bear and decided to exercise my right to keep and arm bears, and Clarice is now well armed for the video. I know they're sexy, but honestly, the Airsoft gun's probably the least important piece of gear you have. We'll talk more about the hat and the chest rig later.
Okay, so let's get right down to this. Get an AEG. Doesn't particularly matter which one, get an AEG. Yes, the manual of arms on an AEG is slightly different from an actual firearm, and you'll get a more realistic manual of arms if you get a gas blowback gun. The problem is with a gas blowback gun, every single magazine is going to cost you about $60 as opposed to these, which are $7 and so cheap you can just kind of throw them around and use them as decoration. But anyways, the gas blowback magazines actually have a gas tank in every magazine plus 2 valves. They cost about $60 each. They all need to be maintained, and if you don't maintain them right, they leak. And if you do maintain them right, they still leak, so don't deal with that. Get an AEG. Now, a lot of people will say, hey, I want a pistol, because every single video game I've ever played since Castle Wolfenstein came out in 1981 started me off with a pistol. The reality is, you don't want a pistol. Not only is it a gas mag with a valve on the bottom and a valve on the back that only holds 10-something rounds, it's also itty-bitty and costs just as much as getting a rifle. So here we have gas pistol. Costs $150, holds 15 rounds, something like that. Here we have a AEG rifle, holds 600 rounds, and it costs, if I remember right, $120. Fully automatic, lots of BBs, works just fine. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the velocity limits at your field, and you just want a gun that complies with the velocity limits at your field. Every field is different. Go play there, see if they're a bunch of jerks, figure out if Airsoft's a sport you want to be in, and while you're there, figure out what their velocity limit is so you can go buy a gun that complies with their velocity limit. Once you figure that out, now we need to make sure you get a gun that actually looks right. Because frankly, if you buy a gun like this, black guy here, and be like, oh, I'll change out the handguard later. Oh, I'll change out the stock later, and then make it look like this fancier thing up here with the rails and all that. The reality is, when you go to change out the stock, we're going to have to rewire, do a bunch of little gunky stuff inside the motor to get the battery connected to the back, replace the handguards, replace the outer barrel, replace the gas block, replace the inner barrel, potentially replace the gas tube, depending on how this is set up. By the time you do all that, if you start out with one of these, this gun costs about $150. If you start with one of these, you're going to spend about $300 making it look like one of these, which will only cost $120 new. So when you go to buy a gun, buy the gun that meets your field limits for velocity and has the external look and feel that you want. Attachments like vertical grips here, sights, you can add these later. We'll talk about them in another video. Same with flashlights if you really feel like putting a flashlight on like that one's got on the bottom. Now, in terms of what manufacturer you should buy from, frankly, it doesn't really matter much. Every gun you can get on the market right now for an AEG is going to have a MOSFET in it. It's going to shoot reasonably well. You're going to get about the same range for the velocity. Yeah, you can tweak things with the hop-ups and the motors and get all fancy with that, but they're all going to shoot about the same. When it comes to putting BBs into teenagers, it doesn't matter much. They all will work fine. I've never seen a situation where I've thought, man, if I just had a more expensive gun, it would work better. It doesn't. So really, when you're deciding between a $120 gun like this was versus a $400 gun like this thing is, really what you're asking is, when this thing breaks, do I want something I'm just going to throw in the trash and not care? Or do I want something that I'm going to have to go order parts from Asia, wait 3 weeks for the parts to arrive? Turns out that was the wrong thing. And then I have to go order some other part, and they sent me the wrong part, and then I got to go return that, get the real correct part finally. And now, after 3 months of having a disassembled gun sitting on my dining room table, which kind of annoys my wife, I finally can fix the thing, as opposed to something that's just disposable. Because the reality is, these are all, no matter which gun, which brand, how it looks, what the velocity is, these are all pretty much Chinese garbage. Whether it was built in Taiwan, aka the Republic of China or if it was made by the commies in the People's Republic of China, you're still buying a Chinese gun. And this is not Excalibur, the sword of Arthur, King of the Britons. This is a piece of Chinese garbage. It will break at some point. It may last a little longer. It may not last a little longer. It may snap the tappet plate or the motor or the gearbox or something else. But eventually it will break and you will need to fix it or replace it. So if you spend a lot of money, you'll generally get a gun with some nicer externals. You can occasionally get quality of life improvements like an easier spring change system or something like that. But the on-field performance isn't going to make much of a difference. Yes, this one's metal, this one's plastic. It doesn't really matter much. It's just a matter of when this thing breaks, I'm going to repair it. When this thing breaks, I'm going to throw it in the nearest trash can and replace it. The same with this thing. When it breaks, trash can, replace. In terms of what brand you should get, frankly, I can only speak to the stuff I've personally owned. G&G makes decent guns. VFC makes decent guns. Lancer Tactical makes decent guns. Matrix Sportline makes decent guns. The Cybergun Colt M4s are also decent guns. You'll notice I mentioned all or three of those while pointing to this exact same gun, because the reality is all three of those come out of the exact same factory in Asia, made by the same dudes on the same assembly line. So regardless of what people say on Reddit about, hey, get this brand instead of that brand, frankly, S&T makes pretty much all of the cheap M4 type airsoft guns that you will find on the market. Somebody will say, hey, the quality control isn't that great. It's a $100 Chinese toy. There is no quality control on any of them. So they make decent guns. They connect BBs to teenagers just fine if you get anything made out of the S&T factory, whether the box says Lancer Tactical or Matrix or any of those other companies. If you want something that's a little more realistic feel, just the metal receivers. Personally, I like the VFCs. If I was going to buy a new gun, it would probably end up being another VFC, and I'd probably end up spending more money than I should. G&G also makes perfectly fine guns. They work.
Overall, as I said before, your airsoft gun's probably the least important piece of gear. But get something that's going to meet your field's limits for velocity, that has the externals that you like, whatever rails or handguards or stocks, things like that. Make sure it comes with all of those things. You generally want to be looking at a price range that's about $100 and above. If you go below that, you do find some really garbage guns. But once you hit that $100 price point, they pretty much all perform the same, and you're really just paying for looks and feel, how it feels in your hand, this heavyweight metal versus lightweight plastic, that kind of thing. Like I said, it's probably the least important piece of gear that you're going to have.